Dear viewers, imagine yourself as a wheat farmer in rural Manitoba. Your family has been working this land for 4 generations. For 60 years, every autumn, your grandfather, your father, and now you have harvested golden wheat from fields stretching to the horizon. And for those 60 years, your life was tied to a system beyond your control. Your wheat was hauled by truck to grain silos. From there, it was shipped by rail to American ports like Seattle, Portland, or Houston. American inspectors determined whether your crop met standards. American dock workers loaded the crop onto ships. American companies collected their fees at every stage. And if there was a problem, if inspections were delayed, if ports became congested, if the political winds changed in Washington, you bore the loss. Your family's income, your children's future, your retirement security, all were hostage to decisions made in boardrooms and political offices thousands of miles away in a foreign country. This was the reality for Canadian farmers until April 14th, 2023. On that date, in Kansas City, Missouri, a ceremonial final spike was driven into railway track. Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern officially merged, creating CPKC, the first and only single-line railroad connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico across 32,000 kilometers of track. The financial details were staggering: $31 billion, years of regulatory battles, a competing bid from Canadian National Railway for $33.7 billion that failed. But the true significance of that merger had nothing to do with corporate balance sheets or shareholder returns. The true significance was liberation. For the first time in Canadian history, farmers in Manitoba could load wheat onto rail cars and watch those cars travel 3,200 kilometers directly to bakeries in Mexico City without ever depending on American infrastructure, American inspectors, American ports, or American political goodwill. The wheat that fed your family for generations could now reach customers without asking permission from a government that had proven itself unreliable, unpredictable, and increasingly hostile. Let me tell you about a farmer we will call Robert, though that is not his real name. Robert farms 1,200 acres outside Brandon, Manitoba. He grows Canada Western Red Spring wheat, a premium variety prized by bakers worldwide for its high protein content and excellent baking characteristics. For 30 years, Robert shipped his wheat the same way his father had. Trucks carried it to a grain elevator. From there, Canadian Pacific moved it to Thunder Bay on Lake Superior or westward to Vancouver. At those ports, the wheat was loaded onto ships bound for international markets, or it was transferred to American railroads for movement to American ports. The system worked when it worked, but increasingly it did not work. In 2024, one of Robert's shipments sat for 3 weeks at the Port of Seattle because American inspectors claimed to find quality issues that Canadian inspectors had never identified. By the time the wheat was cleared, the buyer had canceled the contract. Robert lost $40,000 on that single shipment. In 2025, another shipment was delayed at the border when American customs officers decided to implement new inspection protocols without warning. The wheat missed its delivery window. The buyer purchased from an American supplier instead. Robert lost that sale entirely. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that every Canadian farmer recognized. American control over export infrastructure meant American control over Canadian livelihoods. And when Donald Trump became president for the second time, that control became a weapon. Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian goods. He threatened to tear up trade agreements. He suggested that Canada should become the 51st American state. He created an environment of chaos and unpredictability where long-term business relationships became impossible because no one knew what rules would apply next week or next month. Canadian farmers watched their American market access become a political football, subject to the whims of a leader who viewed economic relationships as opportunities for domination rather than mutual benefit. The uncertainty was crushing. Robert could not plan investments. He could not commit to long-term contracts. He could not guarantee delivery to customers because he did not control the infrastructure his product depended on. Every decision carried risk that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with politics beyond his control. Then CPKC offered an alternative. In early 2025, Robert attended a meeting at the grain elevator in Brandon. A CPKC representative explained the new service. Direct rail from Manitoba to Mexico. Single bill of lading. No transfers between railroads, no American port bottlenecks, no American inspection delays, competitive pricing, reliable transit times, access to a market of 130 million consumers with a growing middle class hungry for high-quality wheat. Robert was skeptical. He had heard promises before, but the representative showed him something tangible, a unit train of covered hopper cars built by National Steel Car in Hamilton, Ontario, Canadian rail cars, a map showing the route from Brandon through North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas into Mexico. The trains would cross American territory, but they would not stop to serve American customers or interact with American export systems. They would simply transit, like an airplane flying over without landing. And most importantly, the representative showed him contracts. Mexican bakeries, tortilla producers, pasta manufacturers, all looking for reliable Canadian wheat suppliers and willing to pay premium prices for quality. Robert decided to try it. In September 2025, he shipped his first trainload of wheat to Mexico via CPKC, 3,500 tons of Canada Western Red Spring wheat loaded into Canadian-built covered hoppers at the elevator in Brandon. The train departed on a Monday morning. Robert could track its progress online, through Manitoba, into North Dakota, south through the Great Plains, into Texas, across the border at Laredo, through Monterrey, arriving at a mill outside Mexico City on Friday afternoon, 5 days from a farm to customer. No delays, no inspections beyond routine Canadian certification, no American bureaucracy. The Mexican buyer was delighted with the quality. Payment cleared within a week. Robert received a better price than he had gotten from his previous American buyer, and he avoided all the fees and uncertainties of shipping through American ports. That first shipment changed everything for Robert. He immediately committed to sending all his export wheat to Mexico via CPKC. Other farmers in his area heard about his success and followed. Within 6 months, the grain elevator in Brandon was sending unit trains to Mexico every week. Multiply Robert's story by thousands of farmers across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. CPKC announced it would move 27 million metric tons of Canadian grain in the 2024 to 2025 crop year. For the 2025 to 2026 season, capacity would increase to 34 million metric tons potentially. These are not abstract statistics. These are individual farmers making individual decisions to abandon American export routes in favor of a system that treats them with respect and reliability. Every ton of wheat that moves to Mexico via CPKC is a ton that does not move through Seattle or Portland or Houston. Every trainload represents lost revenue for American ports, American inspection services, American shipping companies. The economic impact on American port cities will be measured in thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars annually. But from the Canadian farmer's perspective, this is not about hurting America. This is about survival and dignity and refusing to remain hostage to a political system that views them as expendable. The human stories behind these numbers deserve attention because they reveal what economic independence actually means in practice. Consider Maria, a fourth-generation farmer in Saskatchewan. Her great-grandfather homesteaded the land in 1912. Her family survived the Great Depression, droughts, floods, and commodity price crashes. They adapted to every challenge that nature and markets threw at them, but they could not adapt to Donald Trump's chaos. In 2024, Maria had committed to deliver wheat to a buyer who exported through the Port of Houston. Trump announced new tariffs on Canadian agricultural products 3 weeks before harvest. The buyer canceled the contract, citing uncertainty about whether the wheat could clear American customs. Maria was left with 1,000 acres of premium wheat and no buyer. She eventually sold at a steep discount to a domestic processor, losing over $80,000 compared to her original contract. That loss wiped out her profit for the year and forced her to delay equipment purchases she had planned. The emotional toll was worse than the financial loss. Maria's family had always taken pride in their work. They produced high-quality wheat that fed people around the world. They honored their commitments and expected others to do the same. Having a contract canceled because of political chaos beyond their control felt like betrayal. It undermined their sense of dignity and purpose. When CPKC representatives visited Saskatchewan and explained the Mexico option, Maria was among the first to sign up. She shipped her entire 2025 harvest to Mexican buyers via CPKC. The experience was transformative. Mexican buyers visited her farm. They walked her fields. They asked about her growing practices and quality standards. They treated her as a valued partner rather than an interchangeable commodity supplier. When harvest came, the wheat moved seamlessly from her farm to Mexico City bakeries. No drama, no political interference, no last-minute cancellations. Just professional business relationships based on mutual respect. Maria told her neighbors that shipping to Mexico felt like farming used to feel before Trump turned agriculture into a political weapon, and it felt like her work mattered and her product was valued, and her family's future was secure. That emotional dimension of economic independence cannot be quantified, but it is real, and it matters deeply to people whose identity is bound up in their work. Let me share one more story that captures the broader implications. Consider the town of Portage la Prairie in south-central Manitoba. Population 13,000. The economy revolves around agriculture, grain elevators, equipment dealers, seed suppliers, fertilizer distributors, trucking companies, all depend on farmers' success. When Trump's trade chaos disrupted Canadian grain exports in 2024, Portage la Prairie suffered. Farmers delayed purchases. Equipment dealers saw sales drop. The entire local economy contracted because uncertainty prevented planning and investment. By late 2025, the situation had reversed. CPKC as Mexico service provided farmers with reliable market access. They could plan ahead. They could commit to contracts. They could invest in equipment knowing their crops would reach buyers. The grain elevator in Portage la Prairie became one of CPKC's key loading points for Mexico-bound wheat. Unit trains departed weekly, sometimes twice weekly during peak season. Local businesses benefited immediately. The equipment dealers sold 4 new combines in autumn 2025 after selling only 1 the previous year. The fertilizer supplier expanded his warehouse to handle increased demand. A new trucking company opened to serve the CPKC route. The mayor of Portage la Prairie gave an interview to local media describing the transformation. He said that 2 years ago, we were worried about the town's future because Trump's policies were destroying our farmers' markets. Today, we are planning expansion because CPKC gave our farmers an alternative to American chaos. We are not anti-American, but we cannot build our economy on a foundation that shifts like sand. CPKC gave us solid ground again. That statement captures the broader Canadian sentiment. This is not about hostility toward the United States. This is about Canadians taking control of their economic destiny after being forced to recognize that relying on American goodwill and American infrastructure creates unacceptable vulnerability. The railroad infrastructure makes that independence permanent and irreversible. The technical details of CPKC's investment program reveal the scale and permanence of this transformation. Over 500 million Canadian dollars, focused specifically on grain transportation capacity for the 2025 to 2026 crop year. That investment purchased 5,900 new high-capacity grain hopper cars. These are not ordinary rail cars. They're specially designed for bulk grain transport with larger capacity than previous generations, more efficient loading and unloading systems, better weather protection, and lower maintenance costs. Each car can carry approximately 100 tons of grain. 5,900 cars represent the capacity to move 590,000 tons per train load when organized into unit trains. CPKC also took delivery of 100 new Tier 4 diesel-electric locomotives in 2025. These represent the latest in railroad technology. Cleaner burning engines that meet the strictest environmental standards. More fuel-efficient operation that reduces costs. More powerful motors that can pull longer, heavier trains. The combination of new cars and new locomotives allows CPKC to move more grain more efficiently with lower environmental impact than any previous system. But the most important investment is not measured in dollars or equipment. It is measured in human relationships and institutional knowledge. CPKC hired and trained crews specifically for the Canada-Mexico grain routes. These crews learned the operational details of cross-border transport, the regulatory requirements of 3 different countries, the specific needs of grain shippers, and the expectations of Mexican buyers. They developed relationships with customers on both ends of the route. They built expertise that cannot be quickly replicated by competitors. This human capital provides CPKC with a lasting competitive advantage that goes beyond physical infrastructure. The railroad also invested heavily in customer service and communication systems. Farmers like Robert can track their shipments in real time online. They receive automatic updates when trains cross borders, when they encounter delays, when they arrive at destination. This transparency builds trust and allows farmers to communicate accurately with buyers about delivery timing. The system works so well that Mexican buyers now prefer Canadian wheat delivered via CPKC over American wheat, delivered through Gulf Coast ports because their reliability and predictability are superior. The economic implications for American ports are devastating and permanent. Pacific Northwest ports like Seattle and Portland traditionally handled significant volumes of Canadian grain destined for Asia and Latin America. Much of that Latin American grain now moves directly to Mexico via CPKC, bypassing Seattle and Portland entirely. Gulf Coast ports, including Houston, New Orleans, and Mobile, face similar losses. Canadian grain that once flowed through through those facilities to Latin American markets now travels by rail directly to Mexico. Industry analysts estimate that American ports collectively lose billions of dollars annually in revenue from Canadian grain shipments that have shifted to the CPKC route. That lost revenue translates directly into lost jobs for longshoremen, inspectors, shipping agents, and all the supporting businesses that depend on port activity. The irony is that Trump's policies created this outcome. His tariff threats and trade chaos convinced Canadian farmers and shippers that they needed alternatives to American infrastructure. CPKC built those alternatives. Now, the economic damage to American port cities is permanent because the infrastructure and relationships that enable Canada-Mexico grain trade are not going away. Keith Creel, the president and CEO of CPKC, understood the strategic opportunity that Trump's behavior created. In public statements, Creel emphasized that CPKC serves as a land bridge between Canada and Mexico, using American territory for transit, but not serving American markets. This is a crucial distinction with profound implications. Physically, trains carrying Canadian wheat to Mexico must cross American territory. The route from Manitoba to Mexico City traverses North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. 3,200 kilometers, but with a majority passing through the United States. But those trains do not stop to serve American customers. They do not unload at American ports. They do not interact with American export systems. They simply transit, and under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, this transit is legally protected. Trump cannot block it without violating the trade agreement that his own administration negotiated. He cannot impose tariffs on grain in transit. He cannot restrict railroad operations for transit traffic. His leverage over Canadian grain exports has evaporated because the grain is not being exported through American infrastructure. When Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Mexico City in late 2025, he made a point of touring CPKC facilities with Keith Creel. They visited a rail yard where a unit train of Canadian wheat had just arrived. They walked alongside the covered hopper cars built by National Steel Car in Hamilton, Ontario. Carney pointed to the manufacturer's label and emphasized that this was Canadian wheat, carried in Canadian rail cars by a Canadian-owned railroad serving Mexican customers. The United States was completely irrelevant to the transaction. At a grain terminal, Carney was presented with a piece of bread baked at a local Mexico City bakery using flour milled from Canadian wheat that had arrived via CPKC. He broke off a piece and tasted it, commenting that this bread represented a direct connection between Canadian farmers and Mexican consumers with no American intermediaries required. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Canada was demonstrating that economic independence from American control was not merely possible, but operational and beneficial. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand accompanied Carney on the visit, along with Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-United States trade. Their presence signaled that this was not simply a private business arrangement, but a matter of strategic national policy. The Canadian government was actively supporting CPKC's Mexico corridor as a tool to reduce Canadian vulnerability to American political pressure. The investment in railroad infrastructure served the same strategic purpose as the LNG terminals being built in British Columbia or the trade agreements being negotiated with China. All of these initiatives share a common goal of diversifying Canada away from dependence on the United States, so that no single American policy decision can devastate Canadian industries or communities. The farmers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan understand this strategic dimension, even if they do not articulate it in geopolitical terms. They know that having options means having power. They know that depending on a single customer makes you vulnerable. They know that CPKC gives them leverage in negotiations and security in planning that they never had when American infrastructure was the only route to market. The permanent nature of this shift cannot be overstated. The rail cars that CPKC purchased will serve Canadian grain farmers for 30 to 40 years. The locomotives have similar lifespans. The track infrastructure is even more durable, with rails laid in the 1800s still in use today after maintenance and upgrades. CPKC's 32,000 kilometers of track connecting Canada and Mexico will serve North American trade for a century or more. This is not a temporary arrangement that can be easily reversed. This is permanent physical infrastructure creating permanent facts on the ground. Customer relationships are equally sticky. Mexican buyers who have established purchasing patterns with Canadian suppliers via CPKC will not switch back to American suppliers without compelling reasons. They trust the Canadian product, they appreciate the reliability of CPKC logistics, they value the respectful business relationships. Similarly, Canadian farmers who have shifted to the Mexican market will stay there because they found stable customers, receive fair prices, and get paid reliably without political interference. From the Canadian perspective, this transformation represents liberation from a dependence that had become intolerable. For generations, Canadian farmers accepted that reaching international markets required using American infrastructure because no alternative existed. They absorbed the costs, accepted the delays, and tolerated the indignities because they had no choice. Trump's behavior made that arrangement unsustainable. His tariff threats, his annexation rhetoric, his weaponization of trade relationships all demonstrated that American control over Canadian export infrastructure could be used to coerce Canadian policy or simply to inflict economic harm for political purposes. CPKC eliminated that vulnerability. Canadian wheat now reaches a major market of 130 million consumers without requiring American permission, American services, or American goodwill. That independence is permanent, valuable, and worth far more than the $500 million that CPKC invested to achieve it. Trump wanted to increase American leverage over Canada. Instead, he created the conditions that motivated Canada to build infrastructure that eliminates American leverage entirely. The farmers in Manitoba, who now ship their wheat directly to Mexico via CPKC, understand this better than any policy analyst or political commentator. They live the reality every day. They know that independence means security, that options mean power, and that Donald Trump's aggression became the catalyst for Canadian emancipation from American economic control.